Imagine a world so corrupt, so filled with violence and evil, that God himself regretted creating it. A world where wickedness consumed every heart, where giants walked the earth, and where humanity had fallen so far from grace that destruction was the only answer. Now imagine being the only righteous man in that entire world. Your neighbors mock you, your friends think you've lost your mind. For over a century, you build a massive ship on dry land, warning everyone of a flood that seems impossible. But you don't stop, you don't doubt, because God has spoken and you believe. This is the story of Noah, a man who stood alone against an entire generation, who built an ark when there was no rain, who watched the world he knew disappear beneath the waves, and who stepped onto a cleansed earth to begin again. It's a story of faith that defied logic, obedience that outlasted ridicule, and hope that survived the end of everything. Welcome to the story of the man who survived the apocalypse. The earth had become full of people. Generations had passed since Adam and Eve first walked in the garden, and now their descendants covered the world. Cities had been built, families had grown, civilization had spread across the land, but something terrible had happened to humanity. Something dark and twisted had taken root in the human heart. As we read in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Stop and think about those words for a moment. Every intention, every thought, only evil continually. This wasn't just a few bad people doing wrong things here and there. This was humanity as a whole, completely given over to wickedness. From the moment people woke up until they went to sleep, their minds were filled with evil plans. They thought about how to hurt others. They thought about how to take what wasn't theirs. They thought about violence and selfishness and cruelty. And it never stopped. There was no break from it, no moment of goodness, no flash of kindness, just evil, all the time, everywhere. The violence had spread across the earth like a plague that no one could stop. People harmed each other without a second thought. They murdered over small disagreements. They stole without conscience. They destroyed lives and felt nothing. There was no justice in the land, no mercy shown to the weak, no compassion for those who suffered. Strength ruled everything, and the strong did whatever they wanted to the weak. Parents didn't protect their children. Neighbors turned on each other. Trust had vanished completely. The world that God had spoken into existence, the world he had called very good, had become a nightmare. And it wasn't getting better with time. Each generation seemed to sink deeper into darkness than the one before. The wickedness was growing, spreading, consuming everything good that remained. In those days, something very strange was happening on the earth. Something that made the situation even worse than it already was. Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 and 2 tell us what it was. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the way things were supposed to be. There was a crossing of boundaries that should never have been crossed. And this union produced something the world had never seen before. Verse 4 explains, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown, the Nephilim, giants who walked among normal people. They were enormous in size and famous for their strength and power. They were warriors that other men feared and trembled before. Their reputation spread across every land. People spoke their names with shaking voices. Stories were told about their exploits and their victories. These weren't gentle giants using their strength for good. They weren't protectors of the innocent or defenders of the weak. No, they were part of the problem. They added fuel to the fire of violence. They increased the chaos and disorder. Their size and strength gave them the ability to take whatever they wanted, and they used it without restraint. They dominated others. They terrorized communities. They did as they pleased because no one could stop them. You might think that having such powerful beings on earth would bring some kind of order, but it did the exact opposite. The Nephilim made everything worse. They became another source of fear and suffering. The world was already spinning out of control, drowning in wickedness, and these mighty men were pushing it faster toward complete destruction. From heaven, God watched all of this unfold. He saw every act of violence committed on the earth. He heard every cry of pain from the innocent. He knew every evil thought in every human heart. Nothing was hidden from his sight, and what he saw broke his heart into pieces. Genesis chapter 6 verse 6 reveals God's emotional response in words that are almost hard to believe. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Read that again slowly and let it sink in. God regretted making humanity. The creator of everything, the one who had carefully formed Adam from the dust and breathed life into him, wished he hadn't done it. This wasn't just disappointment. This wasn't mild frustration. This was grief. Deep, crushing, painful grief. The kind of sorrow that comes from watching someone you love destroy themselves completely. God had made people in his own image, stamped with his likeness. He had given them the ability to choose, to think, to love. He had placed them in a beautiful world with everything they could possibly need. He had wanted relationship with them, fellowship, friendship, but they had rejected all of it. They had thrown it away like garbage. They had chosen violence over peace. They had chosen evil over good. They had chosen hatred over love. They had chosen to ignore their Creator completely, to act as if he didn't exist. And now, as verse 5 had described so clearly, their every thought was evil all the time. There was no goodness left in humanity, no light in the darkness, no hope for change. The corruption had spread through the entire human race like deadly poison in the bloodstream. Verse 11 adds another detail to this terrible picture. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Corrupt and violent, that's what the world had become. Those two words summed up the entire state of creation. So God made a decision that would change everything forever. Verse 7 records his declaration, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. Everything would be destroyed, wiped away, removed from existence, not just humanity, but the animals too. The birds flying in the sky, the creatures crawling on the ground, all of it would be blotted out. The judgment was decided. The sentence was pronounced. The end was coming, and nothing would stop it. But in the middle of all this darkness and doom, there was one small light shining, one exception to the rule of universal corruption. Genesis chapter 6 verse 8 introduces us to him with these simple but powerful words. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Just one man. Out of all the people living on earth, out of every human being in every city and village, only one found favor with God. Everyone else had turned completely to evil, but not Noah. He was different. Verse 9 tells us exactly what made him stand out from his generation. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Let's break down what these words actually mean. Righteous means Noah did what was right in God's eyes. When he had a choice between good and evil, he chose good. When others were lying to get ahead, he told the truth. When others were stealing to get rich, he was honest in his dealings. When others were hurting people for pleasure, he showed kindness. Blameless means there was nothing you could legitimately accuse him of. His life was clean, his conscience was clear before God and man. He wasn't sinlessly perfect, but he lived with integrity and honor. And then there's that beautiful phrase that sets him apart. He walked with God. This means Noah had a real, living, personal relationship with the Lord. He didn't just know about God from a distance. He knew God intimately. He talked with him regularly. He listened to his voice. He spent time in God's presence. He made decisions based on what God wanted, not on what society approved. Think about how incredibly hard this must have been for Noah day after day. He was surrounded by wickedness every single moment. Everyone around him was doing evil continuously without any shame. The pressure to just go along with the crowd must have been almost unbearable. His neighbors probably mocked him constantly. They might have called him strange, old-fashioned, stuck in the past, too religious. They definitely didn't understand why he lived so differently from them. They probably thought he was crazy for not joining in their evil activities. But Noah didn't cave into the pressure. He didn't compromise his standards. He didn't say, well, everyone else is doing it, so it must be okay. He didn't try to blend in or fit in. He stood firm like a rock in a raging river. He remained faithful when faithfulness was rare. In a world that had completely abandoned God and forgotten his ways, Noah walked with him every single day. Noah wasn't completely alone in his faith and his walk with God, though. He had a family who stood with him. Genesis chapter 6 verse 10 tells us, "And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 sons would play an important role in what was coming, though they didn't know it yet. Noah also had a wife who shared his life and his faith, though the Bible doesn't give us her name. And each of his 3 sons was married too. So there were 8 people in Noah's household in total. 8 people who would matter more than they could possibly imagine. Now here's what's truly remarkable about this situation. In a world where literally everyone was evil all the time, Noah had somehow managed to raise a family that followed God. Stop and think about what an incredible achievement that was. His sons grew up surrounded by violence and wickedness on every side. Every single day of their lives, they saw other people doing whatever they wanted without consequences. They watched their neighbors lie, cheat, steal, hurt, and destroy each other. They got invited to participate. Their friends must have thought they were extremely weird for living differently, for following rules that no one else followed. The peer pressure would have been absolutely enormous. But Noah taught his sons to walk with God just like he did. He didn't just talk about righteousness on special occasions. He lived it in front of them every single day. His wife supported him in this mission of raising godly children in an ungodly world. Together, they created a home that honored the Lord in the middle of total corruption. They built a family culture that was completely different from the culture outside their door. Noah was a father, a husband, the leader of his household. He had all the normal responsibilities that come with family life. He had bills to pay and mouths to feed and problems to solve. He had regular, everyday life to deal with, just like everyone else. But he never used that as an excuse to compromise his faith or lower his standards. He never said, "I'm too busy with work to follow God properly." He never thought, "I need to fit in with society so my family can have an easier life." Instead, he made the hard choice to raise his children to be different, to be set apart, to walk with God no matter what everyone else was doing around them. One day, God spoke directly to Noah. Can you even imagine that moment? The creator of the entire universe, the one who spoke the stars into existence, choosing to have a personal conversation with you. Genesis chapter 6 verse 13 records what God said to him. And God said to Noah, "I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth." These words must have hit Noah like a thunderbolt from heaven. God wasn't suggesting that maybe something might happen someday. He wasn't warning that things could potentially get bad if they continued on this path. He was declaring that the end had already been decided. The verdict was in. The judgment was set. All flesh would come to an end. Everything would be destroyed. And God told Noah exactly why this was happening. The earth was filled with violence through them. Humanity had corrupted everything they touched. They had taken God's good creation and turned it into something twisted and terrible. They had filled it with bloodshed and cruelty and suffering. And now judgment was coming like a flood. But notice something incredibly important here, something that shows us God's character. God didn't have to tell Noah any of this. He could have just brought the flood without any warning at all. He could have destroyed everything, including Noah, and started over completely from scratch. He had every right to do that. But he didn't. Instead, he came to Noah first. He explained what was going to happen and exactly why it had to happen. He gave him advance notice. Time to prepare for what was coming. This wasn't just a warning about destruction and death. It was also a promise of salvation and life. God was including Noah in his plan. He was bringing him into the secret of what would happen. In the middle of this message about the end of the world, there was hope for one righteous man and his family. Then God gave Noah his assignment, and it was unlike anything anyone had ever been asked to do before in human history. Genesis chapter 6 verse 14 begins the instructions. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. An ark, a massive ship, a floating vessel bigger than anything anyone had ever built. Now think about this from Noah's perspective for a moment. He probably didn't live anywhere near the ocean or any large body of water. There had never been a flood like the one God was describing. Some scholars even believe it had never rained on the earth before this time, that the world was watered by mist and springs. Yet here was God telling him to build the biggest boat imaginable. And God wasn't vague about the details or leaving things up to Noah's imagination. Verse 15 gives exact, precise measurements. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. A cubit was about 18 inches, roughly the distance from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. So let's do the math here. 300 cubits long would be 450 feet. That's longer than a football field, longer than most buildings. 50 cubits wide would be 75 feet across. And 30 cubits high would be 45 feet tall. This wasn't a little boat you could build in your backyard. This was an enormous vessel, a ship the size of a large building, something that would take years, maybe even decades to construct. God continued with even more specific details in verse 16. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks, 3 complete stories. A roof with a small opening at the top for light and air circulation. 1 single door on the side for entry and exit. God was giving Noah detailed blueprints, exact specifications, precise building plans. And remember what verse 14 said about pitch? That's a thick tar-like substance. Noah was to cover the ark inside and out with it. This would seal the wood completely and make the entire structure waterproof. Every single detail of these instructions pointed to one unmistakable thing. Water was coming. Lots and lots of water. Enough to float this massive ark. Enough to make this enormous ship necessary for survival. God didn't leave Noah wondering why he needed to build such a massive, strange ark in the middle of dry land. In Genesis chapter 6 verse 17, the Lord explained his plan clearly. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. A flood of waters, not a rainstorm that would pass in a few hours, not a river overflowing its banks, a flood that would destroy all flesh everywhere. Everything that breathed air through nostrils would die. Everything living on the entire earth would perish and be swept away. This was going to be complete destruction, total judgment, the wiping away of all life from the face of the planet. But then came the promise that changed everything and gave meaning to the ark. Verse 18 says, But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Noah would be saved from the judgment. His family would survive the flood. God was making a covenant with him, a solemn promise, a binding agreement that could not be broken. They would enter the ark before the waters came, and they would live through the catastrophe that destroyed everything else. 8 people would be rescued from the judgment. 8 souls would be preserved. But it wasn't just people who would be saved through the ark. Verses 19 and 20 reveal the rest of God's amazing plan. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds. Of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every sort shall come to you to keep them alive. The animals would be saved too. 2 of each kind would enter the ark, 1 male and 1 female, so they could reproduce. Birds that fly in the sky, animals that walk on the land, reptiles that crawl on the ground. Everything that moved and breathed would be represented. They would come to Noah somehow, and he would keep them alive in the ark during the flood. This way, after the waters receded, they could have offspring and fill the earth again. Life would continue after judgment. And there was one more very practical instruction that Noah needed to follow. Verse 21 says, "Also take with you every sort of food that is eaten and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them." Noah needed to gather provisions for the journey ahead. Food for his family to eat. Food for all the different animals with their different diets. Every type of food they would need to survive. He had to store it all carefully in the ark because they were going to be in there for quite a while. God had just given Noah the most important job in human history: preserve life on earth through the coming judgment. And Genesis chapter 6 verse 22 shows us Noah's response. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Simple obedience. Complete faith. Noah believed God and got to work. Noah received his instructions from God, and he didn't waste time questioning or doubting. Genesis chapter 7 verse 5 tells us something powerful about Noah's character. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. That's it. Simple obedience. God said build an ark, and Noah started building. But let's be honest about what this actually looked like. Noah was about to construct something that had never been built before. A ship 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. 3 full decks inside, all made from gopher wood and sealed with pitch. This wasn't a weekend project. This was going to take years of backbreaking work. And here's the thing that made it even harder. Noah didn't live by the ocean. There was no large body of water nearby that would make building a ship seem logical. And most people believe it had never even rained on the earth before this time. So imagine what Noah's neighbors thought when he started cutting down trees and shaping timber for a massive boat. They must have thought he'd lost his mind completely. They probably gathered around to watch this crazy man building a ship on dry land. They likely laughed at him, made jokes about him, called him names, asked him what he was doing with all that wood. And when Noah told them a flood was coming, they must have laughed even harder. What flood? There's no rain. There's no ocean here. You're insane, old man. But Noah kept working. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. His hands got calloused from handling the rough wood. His back ached from the constant labor. His arms grew strong from swinging the tools. The sun beat down on him. His muscles were sore, but he never stopped. He never gave up. He never said, maybe I heard God wrong. His faith was stronger than all the mockery around him. His obedience was greater than all the doubts surrounding him. He trusted God completely, even when everything seemed impossible. While Noah worked on the ark with his hands, he was also working with his words. The New Testament in 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5 calls Noah a preacher of righteousness. This means Noah didn't just build the ark in silence. He warned people. He told them what was coming. He pleaded with them to change their ways before it was too late. Can you picture this? Noah is there building this enormous boat, and people come by to mock him and laugh at him. But instead of getting angry or defensive, Noah uses it as an opportunity to preach. He tells them about God's judgment. He explains that the flood is coming because of their wickedness and violence. He begs them to turn from their evil ways and seek God while there's still time. He's offering them a chance to escape the judgment if they'll just listen and repent and change. But his words fell on deaf ears. The people heard him speaking, but they didn't believe a word he said. They saw the ark growing bigger every day, but they didn't take it seriously. They watched this righteous man work tirelessly for decades, but they didn't think anything would actually happen. Genesis chapter 6 verse 3 had recorded God's words much earlier. My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. God had given humanity 120 years to repent. 120 years of warning through Noah's life and words, but they refused to listen. They continued in their violence without slowing down. They kept doing evil without stopping for even a moment. They were completely blind to what was coming, and they didn't care that this one man was trying desperately to save them. They had 120 years of chances, and they threw every single one away. They had 120 years to change their minds, and they chose not to. For over a century, Noah dedicated his entire life to this mission from God. Think about that timeline for a moment. 120 years. That's longer than most people live even today. Noah was 480 years old when God told him to build the ark, and he was 600 years old when the flood finally came. That's 120 years of faithful obedience. 120 years of building. 120 years of preaching to people who wouldn't listen. 120 years of being mocked and ridiculed. 120 years of standing alone when everyone else thought he was wrong. He had to gather all the materials needed for such a massive project. Thousands and thousands of trees had to be cut down. The wood had to be shaped and prepared carefully. The pitch had to be collected and applied to seal every crack. Rooms had to be built inside for all the different kinds of animals. Storage areas had to be created for all the food they would need. Everything had to be done exactly according to God's specifications. Not close enough? Not almost right. Exactly as God had commanded. And through all those long years, Noah maintained his testimony before everyone. He didn't just build with his hands. He lived righteously with his whole life. His neighbors could mock his ark project all they wanted, but they couldn't point to anything wrong in the way he lived his daily life. He was still righteous in his actions, still blameless in his character, still walking with God every single day, talking with him, listening to him, obeying him. The ark slowly took shape over the decades. First the foundation was laid, then the walls went up, then the decks were built inside, then the roof was put on top. Year by year, it grew larger and more impressive and more impossible to ignore. It stood there like a giant monument in the middle of their world, a towering testimony to God's warning and God's mercy at the same time. Warning because it said judgment is coming, you need to prepare. Mercy, because it said there's a way to escape if you'll just believe and enter in. But still nobody came. Nobody asked how they could be saved. Nobody wanted to join Noah's family in the ark. They just kept watching from a distance, kept mocking from the sidelines, kept living in their wickedness without changing. Finally, after all those years of labor, the ark was complete. Every board was in place. Every room was finished. The pitch was applied inside and out, sealing it completely. It was ready for what God had planned. And then something absolutely amazing happened that proved beyond any doubt that God was behind this whole thing. Genesis chapter 7 verses 8 and 9 describe it, of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground. 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah. As God had commanded Noah, the animals came to Noah. They didn't have to be hunted down or captured with nets. They didn't have to be forced or dragged against their will. They came on their own, as if God himself was leading each one directly to the ark. Picture this incredible scene in your mind. Birds flying from distant lands across the sky, landing near the ark. Animals walking from every direction, making their way through the wilderness to this massive boat. Creatures crawling across the ground, moving steadily toward Noah. 2 by 2 they came in an orderly way. Male and female pairs of every kind of animal that existed. It must have been an absolutely stunning sight to witness. But there's an important detail here that we need to understand. Genesis chapter 7 verse 2 tells us something more specific. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean. The male and his mate, clean animals, the ones that could be used for sacrifice and for food later, came in groups of 7 pairs. That's 14 of each clean animal. Unclean animals came in single pairs of 2. This was God's careful provision for what would be needed after the flood was over. And verse 3 adds another detail. And 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. 7 pairs of birds too, so the skies would be filled again after the judgment. All of this was happening according to God's perfect plan, down to the smallest detail. Noah didn't have to figure out how to gather animals from all over the world. He didn't have to travel to distant lands. God brought them to him supernaturally. They entered the ark peacefully, finding their places in the rooms Noah had prepared for them over all those years. Then God gave Noah very specific timing about when everything would happen. Genesis chapter 7 verse 4 records what the Lord said to him, "For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." 7 days. 1 week left before the flood would begin. The countdown had started. It was time to enter the ark and prepare for what was coming. Verse 7 tells us what happened next. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. 8 people walked through that single door. Noah and his wife, Shem and his wife, Ham and his wife, Japheth and his wife. The only 8 humans who would survive what was about to happen to the earth. They brought all the food with them, just as God had commanded back in chapter 6, food for themselves to eat during however long they'd be sealed in the ark. Food for all the animals with their different diets and needs, grain and vegetables and fruits and whatever each creature required. Verse 5 emphasizes Noah's obedience once again, and Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Everything was exactly as God had instructed. Nothing was forgotten. Nothing was left out. Nothing was done halfway. Then verse 6 gives us Noah's age at this crucial moment in history. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. 600 years old. He had lived 6 centuries on the earth, and now he was about to witness something no human had ever seen before or would ever see again. And then something truly remarkable happened that shows us this was completely God's doing, from start to finish. Verse 16 describes the final moment before judgment, and those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. Read that last part again. The Lord shut him in. God himself closed the door of the ark. God sealed them inside with his own hand. Noah didn't shut the door. His sons didn't shut the door. God did it. This meant there was no going back now. The door was closed and sealed. The time for entering was over. The opportunity for salvation had ended. Everyone who was going to be saved was inside. Everyone who had rejected the warning was outside. And nobody could change that now. For 7 days, Noah and his family waited inside the ark with all the animals. 7 days of silence outside. 7 days of anticipation and preparation inside. 7 days of final opportunity for anyone outside to realize their mistake and cry out to God. But nobody came. Nobody knocked on the door asking to be let in. Nobody changed their mind at the last minute. And then the day arrived exactly as God had said it would. Genesis chapter 7 verse 11 gives us the exact date with precision. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. This wasn't just rain starting to fall gently. This was catastrophe from 2 directions at once. From below the earth, the fountains of the great deep burst open with explosive force. Imagine massive underground water sources suddenly breaking through the surface with incredible power. Water shooting up from beneath the ground like enormous geysers. The earth splitting open and water rushing out in torrents. And from above, the windows of heaven opened wide. The sky let loose everything it had been holding. Water poured down in amounts that had never been seen before. This was the flood God had warned about for 120 years. The judgment had finally begun. There was no stopping it now. And verse 12 tells us how long this incredible downpour continued. And rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days and 40 nights of non-stop, relentless rainfall. 40 days and 40 nights of water bursting from underground sources. The earth was being drowned from above and below at the exact same time. The people who had mocked Noah for 120 years suddenly realized with horror that he had been right all along. But now it was too late for them. The door was shut tight. God had closed it, and no human could open it. The water kept coming and coming without any break or pause. Genesis chapter 7 verse 17 describes what happened as the flood continued. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The ark began to float exactly as it was designed to do. This massive boat that Noah had built on completely dry land was now doing its job. It was floating on water, lifted up by the rising flood, keeping everyone inside safe and dry. Verse 18 continues the description. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. The water levels kept rising higher and higher without stopping. It wasn't just a flood that covered the low valleys and left the hills dry. It was covering absolutely everything. Verse 19 shows us how complete and total this destruction was. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Every mountain on earth, even the tallest peaks, even the highest points of land, all of them disappeared under the water. The flood covered the entire planet. There was nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide, nowhere high enough to escape what God was doing. Verse 20 tells us exactly how deep the water got above the mountains. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. 15 cubits is about 22 feet. The water rose more than 20 feet above even the highest mountain peaks on earth. Every single bit of land was completely submerged underwater. The whole world Noah had known was now underwater. The cities where people had lived and worked were gone. The fields where they had planted crops were gone. The places where they had mocked Noah and his ark were gone. Everything was buried underwater. And through it all, the ark floated safely on the surface, riding the waves, carrying the 8 people and all the animals that God had chosen to preserve through this judgment. The judgment was complete and total and without exception. Genesis chapter 7 verse 21 describes the terrible reality of what happened. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth. And all mankind, everything that lived on land, died in the flood. The birds that had filled the sky with their songs fell silent and dropped into the water. The livestock that people had raised and depended on perished in the rising waters. The wild beasts that had roamed freely across the earth were destroyed. The creatures that crawled on the ground died, and all mankind, every single human being who had rejected God's warning through Noah, was gone. Verse 22 makes it even clearer and more specific. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. If it breathed air through its nose and lived on dry land, it died in the flood. There were no exceptions. The violence that had filled the earth was silenced forever. The wickedness that had grieved God's heart was washed away completely. The corruption that had spread like deadly poison through humanity was removed from the earth. Verse 23 sums up the complete destruction in powerful words. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth, blotted out, erased, removed from existence, wiped away as if they had never been. The earth was washed clean by the judgment of God. But then comes the hope in the middle of all this terrible judgment. The end of verse 23 gives us these beautiful words. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. Only Noah, only his family, only the animals inside the ark with them. They were the only survivors on the entire planet. While the world outside was being destroyed, they were safe inside the ark that God had told Noah to build all those years ago. While everything else died in the waters, they lived and breathed safely. The ark had saved them just exactly as God had promised it would. They floated on the surface of the water above a world that had been completely changed and renewed through judgment. Life inside the ark settled into a routine, though it was unlike any life anyone had ever lived before. Genesis chapter 7 verse 24 tells us how long the water stayed at its highest level, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. 150 days. That's 5 months of floating on water that covered the entire earth. 5 months of living in this wooden boat with all these animals. 5 months of not knowing exactly when things would change. Think about what daily life must have been like for Noah and his family during this time. The animals needed to be fed every single day. They needed fresh water to drink. They needed their areas cleaned regularly to keep the ark from becoming unbearable. Some animals ate plants and grains. Others had different diets. Each species had specific needs that had to be met. Noah and his 3 sons must have spent hours every day just taking care of all the creatures God had brought to them. His wife and his 3 daughters-in-law probably helped prepare food for the family and manage their supplies carefully. They had to ration everything because they didn't know exactly how long they'd be living in the ark. Every meal mattered. Every bit of food counted. But here's the beautiful part of this story that changes everything. Genesis chapter 8 verse 1 says, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark." God remembered them. He hadn't forgotten about them floating on the water. He was watching over them the entire time they were in there. They weren't alone. They weren't abandoned. God was with them. And then the verse continues with these hope-filled words, "And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided." God sent a wind, a powerful, steady wind that began to push the water and help it evaporate and go down. This was God actively working to end the flood. He wasn't just letting nature take its course. He was bringing the judgment to a close on purpose. The waters that had destroyed everything began to recede. Slowly, gradually, day by day, the levels started dropping. The judgment was complete, and now God was beginning the process of restoration and renewal. The water kept going down day by day, week by week, and then something significant happened that everyone in the ark must have felt. Genesis chapter 8 verse 4 tells us exactly when and where it occurred. "And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat." The ark stopped floating. After months of drifting on the water, it touched down on solid ground for the first time since it had lifted off. They must have felt the bump, the settling, the stillness. The mountains of Ararat became the resting place for this massive boat and everyone inside it. But just because the ark had landed didn't mean they could leave yet. Water still covered most of the earth around them. They were grounded on a mountain peak, but they were still sealed inside. They had to keep waiting. They had to be patient longer. Verse 5 describes what happened as time continued to pass. "And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. 2.5 months after the ark landed on Ararat, other mountain peaks started appearing above the waterline. Can you imagine looking out the small window of the ark and seeing mountain tops emerging from the water like islands? Watching the water go down far enough that more and more land appeared? The world was slowly being revealed again, but it looked completely different from before the flood. The flood had transformed everything. The landscape had been completely reshaped. Nothing looked the way it used to look. This was a brand new world they were seeing, washed clean by God's judgment, ready for a fresh start. Noah waited patiently inside the ark as the water continued to go down around them. Then Genesis chapter 8 verse 6 says, "At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made." 40 more days passed after the mountain tops became visible, and Noah decided it was time to check on conditions outside more carefully. He opened the window that he had built into the ark years ago during construction. Then verse 7 tells us what he did next, "And sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. He released a raven, a large black bird that was strong and adaptable. The raven flew out and kept flying back and forth over the water. It didn't come back to stay in the ark because ravens can land on floating things and eat dead animals. It could survive outside even without much dry land. But Noah wanted more information about conditions. He needed a better test. Verse 8 continues, "Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground." The dove was a much better test because doves need trees and dry land to rest properly. They can't just land anywhere like ravens can. They need a safe, dry place. Verse 9 tells us what happened with the dove. "But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. The dove came back because she couldn't find anywhere suitable to land. There were no trees with branches yet, no dry ground where she could rest. The earth wasn't ready. Noah reached out his hand gently and brought her back inside to safety." Then verse 10 says, "He waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark." 7 more days of patient waiting. Then he sent the dove out on a second test flight. Verse 11 describes what happened this time, and it's one of the most hopeful moments in the story. "And the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf." So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. The dove returned in the evening, but this time she brought something precious with her, a fresh olive leaf held gently in her beak. This was huge news. It meant trees were growing again somewhere. Plants were coming back to life. The water had gone down enough that vegetation was appearing above the surface. There was real hope for life outside the ark now. Noah still wasn't ready to leave the ark yet, even with this good news. Genesis chapter 8 verse 12 tells us what he did next. "Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him anymore. He sent the dove out a 3rd time after waiting another full week. This time the dove didn't come back at all. She had found a place to live outside permanently. The earth was dry enough now for birds to survive and thrive on their own. This was another excellent sign that things were changing. Then verse 13 gives us an important date that Noah must have been tracking carefully. In the 601st year, in the 1st month, the 1st day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. Noah was now 601 years old. It was the 1st day of the 1st month, New Year's Day of a brand new year in a brand new world. The water had dried from the earth's surface, and Noah did something he'd been waiting to do for a very long time. The verse continues, "And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry." He removed the covering, probably part of the roof structure, so he could see outside clearly with his own eyes. And when he looked out over the landscape, he saw dry ground stretching before him. The earth was ready for them. But notice something very important about Noah's character here. Even though Noah could see with his own eyes that the ground was dry, even though he could have opened the door and walked out right then, he didn't do it. He waited. Why would he wait when everything looked ready? Because God hadn't told him to leave yet. Noah had learned to obey God completely and perfectly. He didn't move until God said to move. He didn't act on his own wisdom. Verse 14 tells us how much longer he actually waited. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Almost 2 more months passed while Noah waited inside. The earth wasn't just dry on the surface now, but deep down into the soil. Everything was completely ready for life to begin again. Finally, after all that patient waiting, God spoke to Noah again. Genesis chapter 8 verse 15 records the moment everyone had been hoping for. Then God said to Noah, after all this time, after all this waiting, after more than a year in the ark, God gave the command they'd been longing to hear. Verse 16 continues with God's clear instructions. "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you." It was time to leave. God was telling them to exit the ark and start their lives in this new world he had prepared. But it wasn't just about Noah and his family leaving. Verse 17 includes everyone who had been preserved. "Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth. And be fruitful and multiply on the earth." All the animals needed to leave too. They needed to spread out across the earth and have babies and fill the world with life again. This was part of God's plan for restoration. And so they did exactly what God commanded without hesitation. Verse 18 says, "So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. After more than a year inside the ark, they finally stepped outside onto solid ground." Can you even imagine that moment? Breathing fresh air that didn't smell like animals, feeling the warm sun on their faces after so long inside, standing on earth that didn't rock and move under their feet, seeing the sky stretch out endlessly above them, hearing the wind blow through the open space. It must have been absolutely overwhelming and wonderful at the same time. Verse 19 describes what happened with the animals. Every beast, every creeping thing and every bird, everything that moves on the earth, went out by families from the ark. The animals left in an orderly way, by families, by kinds, each group going to find the habitat that would suit them best. They spread out across the land to find new homes and start populating the earth again. The ark had done its job perfectly. Everyone was safe. Everyone had survived. And now the new beginning could truly start. Noah had just experienced the most traumatic and significant event in human history. He'd watched the entire world be destroyed by water. He'd spent over a year locked in an ark with animals. He'd just stepped onto a completely changed earth where everything looked different. So what was the very first thing he did in this new world? Genesis chapter 8, verse 20 tells us, "Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar." He built an altar for worship. His first act in the new world wasn't to build a house for his family to live in. It wasn't to plant crops so they could eat. It wasn't to explore the land and see what had changed. It was to worship God. He gathered stones and built an altar. Then he took some of the clean animals, the ones that had come in groups of 7, specifically for this purpose, and he offered them as sacrifices to the Lord. This was Noah's way of saying, "Thank you from the depths of his heart. Thank you for warning me about the flood. Thank you for giving me instructions. Thank you for saving me and my family. Thank you for preserving the animals. Thank you for your mercy when you could have destroyed everything, including me. Thank you for keeping your promise." And God's response to this act of worship was beautiful and full of grace. Verse 21 says, "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done." God smelled the sacrifice rising up, and it pleased him deeply. Then God made a promise in his heart. He would never again curse the ground because of humanity's sin. He would never again destroy all living creatures with a flood like this one. Now notice something very important here. God acknowledged that man's heart is still evil from youth. The flood didn't change human nature fundamentally. People would still have evil intentions and evil thoughts. Sin was still in the world. But God promised he wouldn't respond with this kind of total judgment again. This was pure mercy and grace flowing from God's heart. Then verse 22 gives us God's promise about the earth itself and how it would function. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease. As long as the earth exists, the seasons will continue in their regular patterns. There will be time to plant seeds and time to harvest crops. There will be cold weather and hot weather. There will be summer and winter rotating predictably. Day and night will keep happening in their cycle. Life would go on in reliable, predictable patterns that people could count on. God wasn't done speaking to Noah and establishing things for this new world. Genesis chapter 9 verse 1 says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." This was the same command God had given to Adam and Eve at the very beginning of creation. Now he was giving it to Noah and his family. Fill the earth with people again. Start humanity over. Repopulate the world. But this time, God added some new rules and instructions for how things would work. Verses 2 and 3 explain the new relationship between humans and animals. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Animals would now fear humans instinctively, and humans could now eat animals for food, not just plants like before the flood. This was something new that God was adding to the arrangement. Then God established something even more important and lasting. Verse 9 records it. Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you. A covenant. A solemn binding promise from God himself. This wasn't just a casual statement. This was serious and permanent. Verse 11 explains exactly what this covenant meant. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God was promising that he would never again destroy all life with a worldwide flood. This was a guarantee, a permanent promise that would last forever. But God didn't just speak this promise with words. He gave a visible sign that everyone could see to remember it. Verses 12 and 13 describe this sign. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you. For all future generations, I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. The rainbow. God placed his bow, his rainbow, in the clouds as a sign of his promise to all creation. Every time it rained and the sun came out and a rainbow appeared in the sky, it would remind everyone of God's covenant. Verse 14 and 15 explain further. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. God himself would see the rainbow and remember his promise. Verse 16 emphasizes how permanent this covenant was. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. Everlasting, forever, eternal, for all time. God would see the rainbow appear and remember his promise never to flood the whole earth again. Noah's story didn't end when he left the ark and offered his sacrifice. Genesis chapter 9 verse 28 tells us, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years, 350 more years of life on the earth. He got to see the world repopulate with people. He watched his sons have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He saw families grow and spread across the earth in all directions. He witnessed humanity starting over. Verse 29 tells us when his long life finally ended, all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. 950 years old, almost 1,000 years of life. He'd seen the world before the flood in all its violence and corruption. He'd experienced the flood itself, and he'd lived in the world after the flood for centuries. His 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the fathers of all the nations that would fill the earth. Through these 3 men, every person who would ever live from that point forward would be descended. Noah's obedience had literally saved the human race from extinction. His faith had preserved life on earth when everything else was destroyed. He'd trusted God when it made absolutely no sense to anyone around him. He'd obeyed when everyone around him thought he was completely crazy. He'd built an ark on dry land because God told him to, even though it had never rained. And because of that faith and obedience, humanity got a second chance. The world got a fresh start. Life continued instead of ending. Noah became known forever as the man who walked with God, the man who found favor in God's eyes when no one else did, the man who survived the end of the world. Noah's story is one of the most powerful accounts in all of Scripture. It shows us what happens when one person chooses to trust God completely, even when the whole world thinks they're wrong. It reminds us that God sees everything, that he judges sin, but that he also provides a way of salvation for those who believe him. Just as Noah found grace in God's eyes, we can find grace through faith as well. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about faith and obedience in a new way, I want to invite you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another biblical story. These accounts from Scripture are here to teach us, encourage us, and draw us closer to God. And if you know someone who needs to hear Noah's story today, someone who needs to be reminded of God's faithfulness and mercy, share this video with them. Send it to a friend. Post it on your social media. Let's spread these timeless truths together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.